If you're like me, you probably really appreciate free 2-day shipping and the abundance of grocery stores. But despite all that, do you ever think about packing up and moving way out into the middle of the woods? I know that I certainly do. Despite all the comforts of modern living, you cannot deny that living out in the wilderness has a certain universal allure. If you really think you want to uproot your life, one place you could go is the forgotten community of Holly in the state of Washington, United States of America. If you look at Holly in person, or even on a map, it appears to be just a sleepy collection of a few beach houses located at literally the end of the road. But in the late 1800s, Holly was part of a string of booming logging towns, the largest of which, Seebeck, was on track to overtake Seattle as the largest city in Washington state. So, what happened? Well, before the 19th century, the area that Holly now exists in was utilized by many Native American tribes, although there is no evidence of any permanent settlement being here. In the second half of the 19th century, settlers from Seattle began to move to Holly and its neighboring communities, drawn to the area because of the logging opportunities promised by the area's undulating coastline. Small, steam-powered boats carried loggers from Seattle all the way across the Puget Sound and around the Kitsap Peninsula to the communities of Seebeck, Nilita, and Holly, a trek that sounds ridiculous today. In 1890, a homesteader from England named Robert Wyatt gave Holly its name when he planted a holly tree that he had brought with him from England all the way here. This holly tree was the first holly tree planted in the Pacific Northwest. By the early 1900s, Holly was a busy logging town, complete with a store, post office, school, and cemetery. A nearby community hall also hosted lively dances, and there was a once-daily connection to Seattle by boat. In 1909, you could finally travel from Seattle to Holly by road. However, these roads were extremely primitive and probably not much more than gravel trails through the forest. The Riverside Timber Company was still active doing logging in the area, logging over 21,000 acres of forest. These logs were processed at a nearby sawmill in Anderson Cove. Although it sounds like Holly was doing pretty well at this time, it was already destined for collapse. Some years earlier in the larger community of Seebeck, a spark from a steamship caught a pile of lumber on fire and burned the town down with flames so hot that it cooked the apples on the trees of the local orchards. Initially, this sent people flocking out of Seebeck and into nearby logging communities just like Holly, but it marked the beginning of the end for logging on the Kitsap Peninsula's west coast. Seattle began to grow into the large, industrious city that it is today, making it more lucrative for settlers to stay in Seattle and work in one of its many growing industries rather than try a logging venture out in the wilderness. Additionally, essentially all of the old growth and easy-to-extract lumber had been cut down, leaving behind timber of lower quality that would be increasingly difficult to access. The town slowly began to evaporate, with its businesses closing and its school finally closing in 1947. Today, the only remnants of this once bustling town are the old Holly School, which is now a seldom-used community center, and the cemetery. Primarily accessible by road, Holly is 10 miles from Seebeck, its closest population center, and 20 miles from the closest proper city of Belfair. Boat service between Holly and Seattle ceased decades ago, but if you feel like driving for an hour and a half, you can still get to Holly from Seattle by road. And thankfully, these roads have developed from those primitive trails into actual roads. So, no need to bring your ATV if you want to drive out to Holly. Although there are some hiking trails nearby, there's really not much to do in Holly anymore. However, it is still an undeniably beautiful place, with the view of the Olympic Mountains across the Hood Canal captivating about everyone who's ever seen it. Anderson Cove, where the sawmill used to be, is publicly accessible and a great place to look at this view. The Old Holly Cemetery is still publicly accessible today as well, and it's most notable for its kind of spooky, unmarked, undated grave, which reads, "Here lies body of unknown man. Died on beach from knife wound." So, yeah, 1800s were a really fun time. If you're not afraid of ghosts, Holly is a truly beautiful and secluded place. And it's really not a bad place to escape to if you feel like running away from city life. Although, for the people who live here, it is a half-hour one-way drive to work, the store, school, pretty much anything. Even though Holly's namesake, the holly tree, no longer even remains, Holly's beautiful, remote landscape is just waiting for someone to give it a new sense of purpose. Maybe even someone like you.